Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here. Welcome to another episode of Vital Descent. This one is episode 275. The show notes may be found at vitaldescent.com/275. In this episode, we're going to be talking about moments that changed the world and moments that altered the course of history. And how does that apply to the current events that we're living through right now with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump and everything that that entails, and how society in the United States is changing and will be changing, and unpacking all of that. But before we get into that, I wanted to remind everybody that we are currently having our summer fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We wanted to extend you an opportunity to help us spread the ideas of liberty and peace. And you can do that by going to libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And we have matching funds. So $10,000 of matching funds. So you can double your gift right now by heading over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate and choose the tiers. We also have a bunch of kickbacks that you can get for doing that. And we really, really do appreciate your help. And indeed, we count on it. So head on over there. So last summer at around this time, I released my documentary, The Truth About Oppenheimer, Part 1. And right after it was released, or like happening as it was released, we also, my wife gave birth to our third son, which is the youngest. And any of you with kids out there, you know that the first year with a newborn is incredibly difficult and it takes up a lot of your time. So while I had intended to get the part 2 out, um, last fall, things got a little bit stretched out. And now I'm really getting into the meat of working on The Truth About Oppenheimer Part 2. And I'm really excited to, I'm kind of going to be teasing it here in this episode, but I'm really excited to be hopefully finishing that up pretty soon and getting that out by the end of the summer. So that's my main goal here. If you haven't seen part 1, go and check it out. I'll put it in the show notes page. But really, really, that's what I want to be doing with this podcast is content like that. And I think that's really what sets me apart from other folks. So as I was working on this, and I have about 8.5 or 9 pages of the script written for the new one. It's going to be twice as long, I'm thinking, as the first one. The first one was like 36 minutes. This one's going to be a bit longer, maybe not twice as long, but. And in the new one is really when I get into the meat of the plutonium injection experiments. Part 1 was interesting because it set the scene, and it did contain a lot of like this human radiation experimentation type stuff that happened before the Manhattan Project and kind of in the beginning of it. And part 1 really leaves off it ends with the Manhattan Project putting all these things together, doing the animal trials and irradiating a bunch of animals, and it ends right as the injection experiments are about to begin. And I don't know, maybe you're in the audience thinking right now, like, Patrick, I thought we were talking about moments that changed the world today. Well, this all ties in, I promise. So I'm just going to play this in the background. In part 2, we get into the actual injection experiments on humans, and we also get into the actual dropping of the atomic bombs, because it is very important in terms of the story. It's like the elephant in the room. It's bad enough that Manhattan Project scientists irradiated, I think it was like 18 Americans without their consent by injecting them with plutonium and other radioactive materials. That's bad enough. For some reason, that's more egregious in our minds than actually dropping the atomic bombs during wartime on a population of civilians and killing like 210,000 of them in 2 incidents. However, that's unavoidable. Like I got to include Hiroshima and Nagasaki into it, but it's like, how much do I really give those 2 events in terms of coverage and time? Because the documentary is really about the Manhattan Project irradiating U.S. citizens without their consent or knowledge. But as I was doing my reading and studying specifically of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of which like the anniversaries are coming up at the beginning of August, I think the 6th and 9th, which is a week out from when this will be a week or two out from when this will be released. But I think the thing that really was impressed into me reading and watching content about the actual bombings and the survivors of the bombings was how the entire history of the world, sorry about that, the entire history of the world changed in the instant that the bomb went off at Hiroshima. And things, of course, had been brewing so much. Like, of course, the world was never going to be the same after both World War One and World War Two, and both of those conflicts changed the world and the course of the world. But really, it was the dropping of the atomic bombs, both on the Trinity site and on Hiroshima, where it was really released to the world that this kind of technology existed, really changed everything in a way that was hard to fully grasp at the time, but was apparent at the time, um, and really cemented the United States as being like the global hegemon in a way that completely shaped the post-world order, began the Cold War in an instant, shaped that post-war era where the United States is the global policeman, where they're going to be doing all these things, projecting power abroad, putting people in their place, and engineering these color revolutions, and doing it all while fighting, global communism and things like that. Now it's fighting authoritarian regimes, and the way that that has kind of evolved through time. Now, another thing that was really impressed on me when I was reading, because there's a few sources that I've been reading from. One is the Plutonium Files by Eileen Wellsome, and that is like the primary source. It's not a primary source, but it's the main source that I've been using to write the script, with a few forays. There are some eyewitness accounts in Eileen Wellsome's The Plutonium Files, and those accounts are like they're pretty stunning, of course, but they're very brief, and she uses it just to kind of put into the minds of folks reading exactly what the effect of the atomic bombs were on Japanese civilians, as it ties into the Manhattan Project and what happened after the bombs were dropped. And I think that after the bombs were dropped, you had officials from the Manhattan Project going in front of Congress and testifying. And there was this huge global, or global throughout the project, this effort to minimize the effects of radiation, or minimize public knowledge and governmental knowledge about the effects of radiation. And I think the reasons for this were a few fold, but one of the bigger reasons is that the those in charge of the Manhattan Project didn't want to be charged for war crimes, because at the same time that the post-war era was kind of building up, you have the Nuremberg trials going on and all of the evils of the Nazi regime being put on a pedestal, never again, and all this stuff. So a lot of these scientists, and I've talked about this before on the show, were very wary of the fact and knowledgeable of the fact that the things that they had been doing were the same things that some of these Nazi doctors and the Unit 731 the Japanese were doing, um, in in Southeast Asia. And they knew that if the truth got out about the horrifying effects of radiation, the fact that they irradiated the United States by dropping the Trinity explosion, causing fallout to be spread to most of the states, and Mexico and parts of Canada, and infant mortality going up. It wouldn't be discovered till after the fact, but infant mortality going up. The fact that Lewis Hempelman, the medical director of Los Alamos, discovered soon after the bomb was dropped that they didn't, at the Trinity test, that they didn't evacuate everyone, that they had missed people in their survey for trying to get them away from the Trinity explosion. And knowing those effects, knowing the effects that radiation had on their secret test subjects that they irradiated with these, plutonium injections, but also knowing the effects just from Don Mastic was one person. He was one of the Manhattan Project scientists who had been basically swallowed plutonium that an ampule broke in his hands and it went into his mouth and down his throat, and he had to be he had some ill effects, but he had to be basically his stomach was pumped a million times to get it out of his stomach, and then he was in charge of taking his stomach contents and distilling it back into plutonium because there was so little plutonium that existed in the world that he had just ingested like half of the plutonium that existed in the world at the time, and it was very expensive to make. So yeah, interestingly, here on the screen you have Lewis Hempelman here in the middle next to Oppenheimer. I don't know the other figures well enough to name them by picture. But you also had other people who were exposed in the Manhattan Project. After the Trinity test, there was a doctor who was exposed to an incredible amount of plutonium, a researcher with the Manhattan Project, and he died. He died within 10 days of being exposed, and the Manhattan Project, the officials watched him die and watched the agony he was in when he died, and they knew because they had also sent out a team to survey the damage at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So they sent out teams who got there, especially at Hiroshima, when the second wave of deaths was occurring from the atomic bomb being dropped. Because the first order was, people who had been irradiated had been melted by the firestorm, who had died horribly charred, crazy deaths with their eyeballs popping out and their flesh hanging in rags off of their bodies. And then the second wave was people who had been exposed to radiation, vomiting, having bloody stools, having bloody diarrhea, and having drinking water for their own demise. Like they didn't know about it, but and then the black rain and the sores that won't heal, and these horrible second order effects of the radiation. And the Manhattan Project sent out this team, and the team, although I think Stafford Warren was on the team and Heimer Friedel was on the team as well. People who Heimer Friedel was directly responsible for these plutonium injections. But and I'm not fully including this in the documentary, some of these details, just for time's sake, but they had sent the team over there. They were going through all of the damage. Like, the only thing moving at Hiroshima was the flies that were feeding off of the decomposing bodies. Like, it was an eerie silence. There were bodies everywhere, people clearly being afflicted by radiation and dying. And the Manhattan Project Task Force sends back to Leslie Groves, who is going to be basically testifying in front of Congress, and Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer on screen, coincidentally, had sent reports that weren't entirely truthful about what the effects were of the bombs on the ground, and said that they had estimated maybe 6 to 7% of the casualties at these sites were because of radiation. Most they reported that most people had died from the conventional explosions and the fire conventionally afterwards. And Oppenheimer and Groves, they had a press conference at the Trinity site, a famous press conference, where they were saying, they repeated this information and said that, we purposefully airburst the atomic bombs because we knew that it would send most of the harmful radiation up and not down, to where it would affect people more. So they were spreading that. I think it was either Stafford Warren or General Groves that went in front of the Senate and testified, or at least at a congressional committee, had testified that by all accounts, dying from radiation was a painless and very pleasant way to go, when that was absolutely not the case, and demonstrably so, that when he gave that testimony, he knew, or there was no way he couldn't have known about the Manhattan scientists who had died from exposure, or he must have had reports on the ground. So thankfully, it wasn't only the Manhattan Project who had people surveying the damage at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that there were independent scientific groups. I think it was part of the Atomic Energy Commission that was sent by the United States to have an independent audit of exactly what the damage was. And in contrast, that report said that the vast majority of casualties at Hiroshima and Nagasaki actually were from radiation. So, thinking about all that and thinking about how this information was disseminated back then, and how that is so different from now, where we're going through these paradigm shifts. And I would posit, and I kind of buried the lead here, but I would posit that the attempted assassination of Donald Trump was one of these paradigm shifting moments. And I'm not saying necessarily that that it was, as big as the atomic bombs, or maybe not even as big as 9/11. But you do get these moments where it seems like things are changing and changing and changing and changing, and it's it's like I don't know what it is, the moment before the stick breaks, where you apply so much pressure, and it's like the straw that broke the camel's back situation, that for World War II and everything that happened, from 1937 to 1945, you have, similarly to what's going on right now, you have, the branch bending and bending and bending, and this pressure being built up. And for the for the modern era, it seems like, well, Trump is elected in 2016, and then you have, this gradual changing and changing, and then, COVID happens, and we're going further and further down this path where at least it appears that a sizable faction of government is so blatantly attempting to um, get rid of a past president, um, a future president possibly, and to alter all those things and change how, maybe some of these things would have been done in cloak and dagger in the past, because let's face it, they always have happened in some way or another. But now everything is just getting so blatant, and you have to wonder if that's because technology means that it can't be secret anymore, or what exactly does it mean? Is information disseminated too quickly, and everyone has a cell phone, that things are just out in the open? Whereas opposed to, for instance, at Hiroshima, like, of course, there was an announcement that was made, but these facts didn't really become apparent until days after, or weeks or years after, for some information. But for this, it was like, when the bomb was dropped, Japanese officials didn't even know what had happened, because communication had been cut off for a few days. So they maybe didn't even know, or it wasn't clear before Nagasaki happened, that Hiroshima had been obliterated with the superweapon. And so all those things leading up to, all the events of World War II, creating this new paradigm. And now in the current age, I think some things are striking as, in the past, there was a lack of information and dissemination of information, but now it's clear that we have the opposite. And things have changed so much now that it's hard to keep up, because we have real time of everything, all that's happening. But we also have this incredibly crazy. I think the biggest takeaway from me was the fact that you have this incredible belief or skepticism by the American people of what is real and what isn't real. And I think that the assassination of attempt of Donald Trump, that the biggest takeaway is that nobody believes it. I mean, like, a conspiracy theory seems like it is the official story. And I mean that in the sense of like the CIA's version of conspiracy theory, right? Because we all know that the official story of 9/11 is a conspiracy theory that, these Saudi, these Arab terrorists hijacked airplanes and crashed them into a building, led by Osama bin Laden from a cave halfway around the world, that, or on the other side of the world, that essentially is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy of people conspiring together to, have some illegal ends. And in the Donald Trump situation, the blue anon kind of conspiracy is that the Trump campaign faked this assassination attempt to bring him over. That's my rough understanding, is that that all happened to secure his nomination and his presidential run. I mean, personally, if I'm just wildly speculating here, but if anything, I think maybe it was allowed to happen. I just don't know how you would have to have a sniper with such pinpoint accuracy. I mean, either I don't believe that the ear injury was faked, and I don't know how you could fake having someone's head, people dying in the stands. So I don't think it was faked. I do think that someone was shooting at him, but I think if anything, it was, this Crooks character. There's been talk about a second shooter on the water tower from a somewhat similar angle. I don't know enough about that, but I would suspect that if anything, the Secret Service knew about it or had allowed it to happen, or that there were certain elements within the Secret Service that knew about it or had allowed it to happen or plowed the way for this to happen. Just my thoughts about it. Um, but again, I keep putting on social media, or at least when I am on Twitter, I put out like, people forget that the deep state is not like one monolith. It's not a monolithic entity. Like that's not how things work, is that there is a singular deep state that supports the Democrats, that supports the status quo, the swamp creatures, and they're behind manufacturing who the president is. I don't think that's the case. I think that what deep state is in some ways a misnomer, because it does imply that single monolithic entity, that is what it is. But there's other power factions that I think are behind Donald Trump, or at least trying to control him or prop him up. And I think that mainly it's the Peter Thiel PayPal mafia type figures. I think it's interesting now that Elon Musk, getting his start with PayPal, is also supporting Donald Trump now. Um, at least from what I've seen. So yeah, and again, throughout this survey of time, it's just another like notch in the progression of information being so widely available to the public, having that control, like for Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves to have a press conference at the Trinity site where they reveal this technology that has been in development for a number of years, but was just no one knew about it, including Manhattan Project scientists, until the news came on the radio that the bombs had been dropped. And now they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna, like Lucifer, the light bringer, reveal to all of you exactly what happened and exactly what we think that you should think about it. Um, whereas this event, people are so, after COVID happened, and I think we're still understanding the effects of COVID, and I think the way that it has broken people's brains, like completely, it's like if you could get an entire population of people to like take DMT or blast off on mushrooms or LSD or something, and completely reframe the way that people think about things and the way that they perceive things, and then inject all this new emerging technology into it. The fascinating takeaway that is being somewhat discussed, but not as much as like the sideshow of, what happened and who did what to whom and who wants whom dead. I think the takeaway is the discussion around it, but also, who who's casting the shadows on the cave wall that we're chasing. I think that it's important to keep that in mind more so, like with 9/11, and I do this opinion I do owe a bit to James Corbett and his coverage of this event. Like, let's not spend the next 4 decades arguing about, was Matthew Crooks or whatever his name was, the shooter, was he a patsy, and who, whatever, how did he do it? Who in the Secret Service knew about it? I mean, those are all important things to consider, I suppose, but it's more important, I guess, to do the who as opposed to the how, like with 9/11. Like, who did these things and not exactly what was done, but who did it and why, I think, are the most important questions. And how do we approach those questions? But again, with the emerging technology now, everyone is skeptical of what happened. I mean, this would be unthinkable when JFK was assassinated, that everyone would be like, the default opinion would be that this is not what it's presented to be. I think that's incredible. And now all this stuff with, it was recently came out that this weekend, 2 days ago from point of recording, or yesterday, that Biden will not be running for president. And he releases a letter signed by him from his Twitter account. Like, and some people are speculating, like, comparing his signature to other executive orders to say that, well, this is not Biden. This is some staffer forged his signature, and Biden actually is sick with COVID and he's actually dead. Like, this stuff it's crazy. And, like, let's just take a second to respect the fact that we've gotten to this point where people don't believe anything, and they go off on these crazy, like, assumptions and investigations of whatever. And, like, is this a sign of more to come, that in the future we're going to have more skepticism? And does skepticism have to come with crazy, like, hypotheses about what happened and all this scheming and ideas about it? Like, I know I'm posing a lot more questions than I'm answering here, but I think it's resting on that, and keeping it in mind with, like, I was alive during 9/11, and everyone believed what they saw on TV. I mean, not everyone, obviously, but maybe that was the beginning of this kind of mainstream conspiracy theorizing. I mean, of course, it probably started a bit earlier than that. Like, I mean, after the fact, so many people thought that JFK was killed by, the Secret Service, or the FBI rather, um, or the CIA or something like that. And that was out there, and maybe that was just the seeds of this. But now it's so past that point. It's just absurd. And I don't know what that portends for the future, but it certainly is like a wild kind of space to be living in right now. So I think that's just kind of the thought that I wanted to get out. Um, how all these things are changing so rapidly, and all these events are just one after another. And what are the next 5 months going to be like? Like, I've seen people, fucking Laura Loomer on Twitter, and I know that she's known for her quality of journalism, sarcasm. Um, but people also, I don't know. I was skeptical when people were reporting that Biden was going to drop out, but some people are saying essentially that he's going to be like, stepping down as president for the next 5 months. So maybe by the time that this episode releases, that will have happened, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just reading through some of these comments on Twitter. Max Blumenthal says Biden did not announce his withdrawal from the campaign in a televised semi-statesman-like speech, but through a tweet with a digitally generated signature on Elon Musk's Twitter, X. This was not only a flagrant insult to the American public, it was the latest act in the coup that is playing out before our eyes while we're told democracy is on the ballot. Interesting take. Jimmy Dore says it feels like this was the party's plan all along, which is why they didn't allow any debates or a real primary, and why they had to make sure they forced RFK out of the primary because he would be next in line for the nomination in this situation. Doing it this way, only loyal establishment party delegates would be selected for the convention. So when the party finally forced Biden out, they would have the only establishment loyal delegates to choose the new nominee, assuring an establishment nominee. So the Democrats rigged another primary, which makes that 3 in a row from the party who says that democracy is on the ballot. Lol. Once again, the Democratic Party doesn't have elections. They have a selection for the presidential nominee, and you're just going to have to take it. So that is interesting how, like, I think it's pretty clear that the RNC did not want Donald Trump the first time around to be its candidate, but he just won out. So, yeah, just really interesting stuff here. So if you want more of an update on where I'm at with the Oppenheimer Part 2 script, I'm still working on it. At this point, I'm through the first 3 injections, and then right now I'm in the middle of like Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the fallout from that, pun intended. And after that, it's like most of the injections, but the first 3 I think are critically important in terms of story. And then the other ones, the other 15 ones, they're not going to get as in depth of a treatment, but just to say that these existed and kind of the circumstances around those, and then how that continued on. Because one of the crazy parts is like they did the first 3 injections before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you would think like, oh, well, the atomic bombs are dropped and World War II is over. Well, that's the end, right? We don't have to keep doing this because time isn't of the essence anymore to end this war. Wrong. Most 15, the vast majority of the injections happened after World War II was over, and it was already like we had secured victory. So if you want more details on that, head on over to What They're Not Telling You. It's vitaldescent.club is the URL, my membership newsletter. That's how I'm doing, if you want to support the show as well. I'm doing all my premium subscriptions through that website. But if you want to, head on over to libertarianinstitute.org and help us out with our fundraiser /donate. You get kickbacks, and you help us stay operational. So we'll check you guys next time. Thanks again for stopping in, and keep your eyes open for Oppenheimer Part 2 updates. Peace.